So, I don't know why I'm having a hard time making this video, but I wanted to make a video on the subject of looking back and basically how Jesus said that those who look back aren't fit for the kingdom of heaven. Um, but if we consider a timeline, and of course, no beginning, no end, non-duality, yada yada, we realize that there isn't really a timeline, and time isn't actually linear. But if we pretend that this is the case for a minute, we don't look back. So if I turn around and look back, we're still going forward in time. Yet this points to something incredible. It points to, it almost seems as if you are completely cutting through all identification. And I was that way in the past, and this happened to me in the past, and so I'm bringing this into my future. And when we have conversations with people, we realize that, or we may see that we have all these patterns about talking about how things went badly for us, or how we dislike something, or we talk about how we are. And there's all kinds of motivations for talking this way. Sometimes it's to be understood, to be relatable, to be liked. And I don't suggest being really hard on yourself and literally like not looking back, but realize that you're never actually looking back. And so there's no need to bring those things with you. So often I see people write out things, and expressing these is completely fine, and I don't mean to put any sort of limits or tell you what you should or should not do, but we get caught in these thoughts about how we are or how the situation went. For me, a lot of this is like replaying a conversation or feeling very unsettled after a conversation, and then trying to sort of figure out like how it went or how that person thinks of me. And then there's like a bunch of like trying to control and just feeling generally crappy about it because I'm receiving that emotional guidance that I am looking back. And I think that's a lot of the reason that like people who consider themselves introverts, which considering yourself an introvert when you actually want to be comfortable in any situation, whether there's people or not, and who doesn't want to be, is a looking back, is an identification. But a lot of, like, one of the defining characteristics of being an introvert is that you lose energy when you're around people, where an extrovert supposedly gains energy around people. What the extrovert isn't doing is they aren't thinking those thoughts about themselves, and they aren't trying to hold a conversation where they're present with the conversation, they're present with the other person, and they're not bringing it back upon themselves. And so when we realize that we don't have to look back, and at first we see all that that kind of low energy, and we see how those thoughts are perpetuating it, we become completely free of our personalities, which is a very cool thing. And also, like, when I say free of our personalities, does this mean devoid of personality? Absolutely not. It means we're actually free in the moment to express who we are without having to look back and worry about how that's going to feel later after the conversation. And it's exactly that looking back that makes us have social anxieties and things like that, because we're actually, it's not that we're traumatized, but it's almost as if we're traumatized from beating ourselves up after conversations or after awkward interactions so severely that anytime we have an interaction, we see that as a possibility for that happening in the future. So we're looking in the future and we're looking back at the very same time. There isn't that timeline, but even considering the very basics of that, if there was that timeline, you can and do never look back. You're always headed forward. And so if we look forward, there's a lot more clarity and a lot more ease going through life. If you hear my dog panting, he is kind of running around here and checking back on me. But Nisargadatta talked about how there's space, it seems to be there's space, and then there seems to be time. And so how we imagine time on a timeline is very interesting. And when you look up etymology of certain words, it seems to go back to like geometry or physics, and a lot of words mean something like pushing or pulling or something very basic, and yet they seem to evolve to have all kinds of emotional connotations. I use the example of the word cringe a lot, which just means a literal drawing back on itself, and yet cringe means all kinds of aversion, and then aversion that we're like, oh, this person is embarrassing, and so then we have expectations for ourselves to avoid that. And what we know from non-duality and a universe of no exclusion is that when we avoid things, we actually draw them to us. So that doesn't work so well. So I looked up the etymology of the word figure, which I found very interesting because I was feeling kind of off, and I just wrote out the sentence, I need to figure this out. So the word figure stood out to me, and I thought so figure means both to think, and it means like the human figure or the figure eight or a basic drawing. And so thoughts are things, and everything utterly comes back to the basics and comes back to that whole space-time thing. And so like cringe, turning back on itself, realizing that you can't actually do that. You're never actually doing that. And so that's exactly why we have the emotional guidance or the emotional discord when we're doing that. Because that is love bringing us back to, or inspiring us to release those thoughts or that interpretation or how we're figuring things to be, and be. So what I'm saying is you can't actually look back. And so there are certain perspectives that you can see things. Like I talk about the character versus the author perspective. The author has nothing but sheer appreciation, sheer inspiration. And so from the character's perspective, if something very unfortunate happens to the character, it's simply unfortunate, and the author is seeing it through this lens, this much wider lens, and also knows that the character isn't a real entity and that there's no real we're not playing for keeps. So you can't, from the perspective of the author, from the perspective of pure awareness, or like Abraham Hicks talks about being in the vortex, you can see things in your life that you may have judged as very negative or wrong or bad, and you can see them for gifts, or you can see how you created them or why you created them. And not necessarily that there needs to be a how or a why, or it needs to be understood as a gift, but that negative perspective of that's what I mean by looking back, is the discord when we look back on it is just gone. And I experienced recently how we perceive things, not how when we want them to be, and we perceive them completely off. When we take things personal, when we take things from the character perspective, it's like when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me, only there's just you, and you and me are the same, and we don't really have to feel bad about ourselves for doing that, but laugh about it and realize that it wasn't worth the suffering when we were doing it. And I just like turning two different people into one. Um, and you see what sort of like illusions and tricks and houses of mirrors you create when we're seeing things from that character perspective. And like it literally, it sort of is like a house of mirrors. But yeah, going back to like figures and geometry and that there's space and then there's time. And to the author, there's never any space and there's never any time, and yet there's this still like creative medium to work within. I love like old cemeteries, antiques, old houses, stuff like that. I just love, and I love looking up certain parts of history and stuff. But why I love it and what it's shown to me is that there's this utter vibrancy that remains, and that like nothing ever dies and nothing is ever lost. And like seeing the sort of synchronicity in a graveyard and um, just sort of like feeling the energy of places, you realize that that's always you and you've never left and never gone anywhere. And so, again, timeline, do you remember your birth? And so, why do we worry about our death, or why do we assume that's actually real and give up the beauty and the sheer possibility of the moment right now for that idea? And so our looking forward is a looking back. And when we truly look back at what's looking, you can't see yourself and live.